something on which you can marginalize some people. It's not a process of numbers, as some people. The outcome is determined by numbers, but the process must have a consensus that everybody is agreed with what is being done, that it is fair to all. So fairness of the process entails consensus on the process. That is the first thing. Now, in the Kenyan election, I think there have been two flashpoints. The first flashpoint was the killing of Chris Musando. 9 days to the election. Chris Musando was the manager of the ICT, which is at the heart today of the controversy, how the results were managed. The management of the results was a process of the ICT. So the killing of Musando created, I think, a huge credibility problem for the election to start with. Now, that translated into what we saw post-polling, where the ICT was indeed involved. The communication of results became problematic, leading to a nullification, which was again something unprecedented. A nullification. And as I commented earlier on the nullification, I think the point to learn from there is the debate we have been having here on quality or quantity of the election. That you cannot have quantity that does not arise out of a quality. Quality is more fundamental than the quantity. Quantity must arise out of a quality. You cannot talk about numbers in a parliament, which is what even here people are talking about. We have the numbers. How did those numbers arise when you have hundreds of petitions? So the thing that we learned from the judgment was that the quality of the election must be supreme. If you violate the constitution, if you violate the laws, then you cannot talk about the numbers that arise out of therefrom. So, what I think has been grappled with right from the time the Supreme Court of Kenya nullified the elections was how then can the next election be credible? And I think the opposition, the NASA group, has been focusing on the areas that were subject to the judgment, which was one, the commission. Because remember, in the judgment, they found that there were fake result forms. Form 34A, Form 34B, Form 34C were fake. And the question is, how did fake forms get into the hands of the Electoral Commission for them to be used to declare results? So there is a question on the Electoral Commission, the credibility. The judgment touched on the credibility of the Electoral Commission itself. And so NASA has been demanding reforms of the commission itself ahead of the election. And I think they clearly have a point in demanding that. And nobody has been contesting it. What has been contested is how can that happen and they still have an election within the prescribed time prescribed under the Constitution, which is, I think, it's 60 days, that within 60 days they can reform the system and have an election. That has been the contention. So the grievance has been the commission, which was judged to have acted fraudulently, to the procurement process, because if those forms were procured, I think from some companies in the Arab Emirates or whatever. So the question that they have been saying, if there is a leakage in this system, shouldn't we have a review of the procurement process and the procurement of the technology that was hacked into? If this technology was hacked into, which is what the judges said, how do we have an election without reviewing how the technology is acquired and what type of technology is acquired? So they have been raising two issues, I think. One, the commission. Two, the process, the procurement processes. But very clearly, these could not be addressed within the 60 days. Now, matters, I think, then became worsened when Jubilee decided to amend the laws. Now Jubilee says if there are laws that are troublesome, let's get rid of them. And so they set out to amend the laws that affect the election. Now that became a further complication, I think, of the matter. And again, I think Jubilee was simply saying, since we have numbers in Parliament, we can go ahead and amend the laws. That is problematic, especially when the laws or the rules of the game are being changed during the game. Because remember, it is the same election that is continuing. That's why there were no new nominations. Once the election is annulled, they took a position that it is the same election going. So those who were nominated remain the candidates. So if the election is underway and you are changing the rules in the course of the game, then you are creating a problem. So I think that became the third complication. Now, it's not true, I think, that NASA has taken, from what I have read in their statement, I think their intention is not to abandon the election. Their intention, as I understand it, is a tactical maneuver. Create a situation where time will be enough for all the reforms they want to actually happen and they get the election. And that is why they are relying on the judgment of the Supreme Court, which said that if in the rerun a candidate dies or abandons the process, then that process collapses and another election is now organized according to the normal electoral process. In other words, new nomination, you have a fresh election. So I think they are exploiting that provision. And it was not an express provision in the law. It arose in the judgment of the Supreme Court. But of course the Supreme Court can make law. The interpretation of the Supreme Court is a process of legislation. So the Supreme Court expanded what was in the law, because the law only talked about death. If one of the candidates dies, they expanded it to include if the candidate abandons. And so they say, okay, this is an avenue, let's abandon, and in which case we go back to a fresh election. So then there will be no excuse for lack of time to address our grievances, to address their grievances, which were the Electoral Commission, the procurement processes, and the like. So it's going to be very interesting how this is addressed. It's quite unfortunate that it appears quite clearly that the Electoral Commission itself is divided. In the statement of NASA, I saw them saying that 4 commissioners belong to Jubilee. So maybe those who don't belong to Jubilee belong to them. Now that is the most unfortunate thing that can happen in an election. That means that that commission is dysfunctional. And indeed, there has been public tussling between the chairman of the commission and the CEO of the commission, one accusing the other and the other one. So I think it will be interesting to see how they work around all these issues. But for me, I think that the similarity of Uganda and Kenya is that we have not given the electoral processes the supremacy that they should assume. Supremacy meaning that agreeing on the processes must be critical and is fundamental to the building of the stable state, any stable state. Because don't forget, election is about decision making by the country. That is the most fundamental thing that puts us together. How do we decide for Uganda? That's the power we talk about when we say people have power. They exercise that power through decision making, and the most direct way citizens participate in decision making is the election. So it's the most fundamental process in any country. That process must be agreed on. It must achieve maximum consensus. The process must be absolutely transparent, so that if there is a bad loser who does not want to agree to the outcome, that bad loser is isolated. Say, no, but it's very clear you lost. Everybody should be able to say, no, this is very clear you lost. When that one is not there, then you have a problem with the country, with the process. You've seen, I mean, we've had very heated contestations in FDC, as you have been seeing, very heated. But we have never had a petition, because the process is done with the concurrence of everybody on how we conduct the process. It is done transparently in the presence and view of everybody. The voting is transparent, the counting is transparent, the announcement is transparent. So you have no way, you person who has participated, to say, I think I was cheated. You have no way even of starting. And that is what needs to happen in all these political processes. Talking about numbers that themselves are questionable, is missing the point. There must be a consensus through dialogue. There must be a dialogue that generates a consensus, a national consensus on how elections will be conducted. That is the transition that we are looking for here. It's shameful to hear Mr. Museveni talk about numbers when he went to the bush having got one MP, you know? And those who had numbers were a short while later vanquished. So where were the numbers? Because it meant that that one MP actually embodied the aspirations of the greatest majority of Uganda. That majorities were manufactured. Majorities are manufactured. That's why we are in problems. You cannot talk about this parliament being a majority. You know, we have the numbers. Numbers that are just rigged. MPs who are fearing their own constituencies say we have numbers. They cannot even. Every MP now has security to guard them again from their voters. This is what is happening here. Every MP, some have pickups of guards. Like Magezi, he goes with a pickup of guards, guarding him from his voters. And you say we have numbers. Which numbers? Nonsense. So I think we should be humble in how we manage political processes. We must generate maximum consensus. Now, those who control power when they are not a majority use coercion, they use force to do so. And they won't give it up easily. That's why there must be a struggle. That's why there is a struggle. Even here, that's why there must be a struggle. Except that how the struggle is managed is also important. The struggle should not be a source of destruction. Once the people have shown their resolve, the few people who are holding on to power must respect them, humble themselves, and have a dialogue out of the problem. And that is where I think there is a deficiency in the management of transitions in Africa, not just here. Now, maybe the other thing that comes to focus in the Kenyan process is the role of the international community. I think the international community continues to play a negative role in political processes. And this is quite unfortunate. The international community has taken a view that stability is the primary factor to consider in a political process. And stability, they translate it to mean supporting the strong, supporting the one who already has power. because then that will keep the status quo. They think that that's stability. Sustainable stability can only come with justice. You cannot have stability with injustice. And they don't seem to get it. They made very strong statements before the petition was ruled on in Kenya. How, you know, NASA should concede, how, you know, making very, very outrageous things of judgment, making a judgment in a political process. And doing so under cover of wanting to maintain stability. I have had the same issue with them here, you know, in all the elections. I think the international community needs to reflect on the whole question of sustainability of stability. Mr. Museveni has been himself here saying that Uganda is secure today. It has never achieved the security as it has today in its entire history. In 500 years, this is the only time that Uganda has enjoyed security. I would say in our entire history, possibly this is the time we are most insecure. Why? Because security is not just the absence of war. People who are hungry are in security. Hunger is a source of insecurity. Joblessness. People who have no social security, who have no housing. They don't know where they are going to sleep. They don't know what they are going to eat. They have no sense of future. And you say you are having a secure country in that kind of a situation? You can't. And Uganda has never had the levels of unemployment as we have today. You know? People who are hungry, who are destitute, people who are on the streets, homeless in Uganda, displaced communities who are living in camps, camps of the displaced, internally displaced, hundreds of thousands of Ugandans, you know? So that is the problem. How do we interpret, how do we translate these phenomena that we have in the country? So the international community will hail Museveni for, you know, being efficient at repressing Ugandans so that nobody is talking. There is stability now, nobody is raising his head. It's completely wrong. And it harmfully interferes with the processes that can restore justice in the country. Because then they bring in funding and all kinds of things that provide succor and support for dictatorships. And this is not new. In the Cold War, it was worse. The same Europeans and the Americans were supporting dictators all over the world. It seems they have not learned anything from the mistakes that they made then. Of course, they claim that they are doing so in the interests of their people, but I don't think that that is even in the interest of their people. So I am not, you know, very happy about how these interferences affect our. Now, when we make these comments here in Uganda, I have tended to see to see the response in Kenya translate into into a situation of judging us either to support NASA or to support Jubilee or to oppose Jubilee. My remarks definitely should not be seen in that light. I do not have partisan interests in Kenya. I have no partisan interests in Kenya at all. And I believe Kenyans will know that Raila has come here and actually campaigned for Museveni. Ruto has also come here and campaigned for Museveni. So from my own standpoint, I have no reciprocal position to support one or the other. My remarks are purely based on what will generate a sustainable transition to a democratic dispensation. What is just, what is fair, and that is what I think we all should rally around. I think the Kenyans will do well to intensify dialogue out of the situation in which they may find themselves. That will save a lot of things. Here in Uganda, it's important that we consider undertaking reforms, fundamental reforms, through a dialogue process. We know that that dialogue will not come easily. We must work for it. Dialogue does not come easily. Dictators don't go away easily. We must struggle until they are forced to accept that Ugandans have a say and there is a meaningful dialogue to a new dispensation. I think those are all the remarks I would like to make. Maybe if you want a summary in Uganda.
Okay, just maybe before you go to the Uganda, would you do what Raila did in an election here? Would you actually take a move like that?
Well, you see, the circumstances are completely different. I have told you that, and that is what even I've seen some of the commentators here making a mistake of saying, you know, the opposition here has no capacity to withdraw from an election. That's not the case. Even himself, he hasn't withdrawn. He hasn't withdrawn from an election. All he has done is to tactically present a challenge for the election, that the election shouldn't go ahead. They should start a new process, which, as I have said, derives from the legal framework that they have. Now, if that is not there, and you just say we are pulling out of the election, the dictators will just go ahead. And mark you, he hasn't pulled out of the election, he has called for demonstrations. They are not pulling out to sit. They are saying, no, we must have a free and fair election. That is a form of struggle, I think, that is prudent. Again, I wouldn't like to, you know, make judgments on other people's polities. But for people who feel aggrieved to assert their will and stop a process that they think is unfair, is something that we ourselves should always consider. The bottom line is the election must be free of, and I have, you know, even in the last election, you remember my platform was, we shall win by defiance, not just going to the election and campaigning and people coming and voting, and you think that that is going to change the unfair system. It won't. Must be a struggle. So how you struggle, how you maneuver the field of struggle may be different. I think the Kenyans have a completely different environment, legal environment, political environment from ours. Kenyans have blocks of tribes. we don't have blocks of tribes here. So they have a different kind of process that you cannot, you know, translate into what goes on here. But the bottom line is, yes, there must be consensus on how processes are managed, and that consensus can only arise through struggle. It doesn't come easily. I guess that's all.